Howdy everybody, Steve here, KM9G. Today we're going to talk about batteries. We're going to talk about lithium iron phosphate batteries in particular. They're currently the safest, most energy dense battery on the market as of the time of making this, and I'm hoping something better is going to come along. Not because I don't like them, but because they are awesome. They being battery improvements. I'm going to show you a battery, then we're going to talk about how to do some math to figure out what size battery you need. This one here is from Sycon, Ideas for Energy, and this is a 12.8 volt, 100 amp hour battery, which as y'all math folks know, that's 1280 watts, and it's got a big old plastic cover on it. Oh, it had two little spaces. All right, so that gets the covers taken care of. It comes with covers over the battery terminals, which are nice. That way you don't short things out in shipping. And then it comes with 4 M8 bolts and some bolt covers. That's fantastic also. Let's take a look at the manual real quick. Recharge every 3 months. This is not a car starting battery. Everything else seems pretty obvious. Here's some of your specifications. Charge temperature 0 to 55 Celsius. Discharge minus 20 to 65 Celsius. Storage is 20 to 35 Celsius. Self-discharge per month is less than 3%. Max in parallel 4, max in series 4. Made out of ABS, and the size is 13 inches by 7 inches by 8.5 inches, roughly. 5,000 cycles, so it'll probably last you the rest of your life. Let's look at some of the protections that it has. Charging overcurrent protection, yes. Discharge overcurrent protection, yes. Short circuit protection, yes. High temperature protection, 54 degrees Celsius. Low temperature cutoff for charging, minus 15. High temperature protection for discharge, 75. And then there's no low temperature protection discharge specified. Shows you how to wire them in series or in parallel, and then shows you how to install it. We've done a couple of videos on different ways to use these batteries. So the manual had some pretty good information in it, the usual technical specs, the usual suspects on the specs, and we got to the bottom of that real quick. What I am going to do is I'm going to charge this up and I'm going to discharge it, and I'll give you some information on the discharge portion of the process, and we will take a look at some math on how to figure out how long this battery will last with a couple of different popular radios today. All right, we just got the Sycon battery fully charged up with the Power Queen 40 amp charger. So it took about 2.5 hours to charge. So a 100 amp hour battery with a 40 amp hour charger. 40 plus 40 is 80. And then you've got 20 left over to get you to 100. So 2.5 hours gets her charged up. So I say all that because that's just how easy some of this math is. We'll get into a little bit deeper math a little bit deeper into the video, but now I got to get this thing started discharging. So we're going to put a load on it, and this load is going to measure the power coming out of the battery and get you a nice report. So in order to test the amount of power that you can get out of the battery, you need some way to convert that power into something else. And this is made by a company called MakerHawk, and I will leave a link to it in the description down below. It doesn't come with the fancy yellow case. That yellow case comes from Gigaparts, and it just kind of holds the thing in place. And what we have is a regular wall wart power supply, which plugs in to the back here, and this thing will also run off of USB power if you don't have a way to give it AC power. And then you take the 2 alligator clip leads and you plug these into your battery somehow. So we're going to get that whole thing wired up. And what it does is it takes the electricity out of the battery, I'm pointing at the battery over there that you can't see, and converts it into heat. And then this guy here will take and dissipate that heat out into the room. And this is all I need on a 90-degree day here in Texas. But we're going to get this thing calibrated and tuned up and ready to roll on a spare battery so I don't ruin the load on this battery. All right, let's get this thing plugged in to wall power, and it beeps and it says, "Welcome." And then there's a couple of things. It's got a temperature sensor on here, 23 degrees Celsius, and it says energy 7.46 watt hours. And I have a spare battery. This is from Denko, and as you can see, I use this out in the field. And what I'm going to do, these alligator clips actually are fairly compatible with power pole connectors. So I plug one in like that, and then I take my negative lead over here and I plug in this thing here. And that immediately starts that fan running, which is why I want to do this on a spare battery first. And then you can see we've got 12.3 volts coming in, and our current is 4.5 amps. And if I turn this knob, I can turn up our power consumption. I want to get this somewhere around 10. There we go, it's 10 even. And then this one here is a little more fine control. We were already set pretty good on to 10 even. And then this is going to turn battery power into heat, and that fan is going to turn that heat into the room. So this thing is all calibrated and ready to go. And you can see this thing is climbing up on watt hours. So I'm going to long press this, and that'll reset that number. Now that I've refreshed myself on how to use this thing, let's get this battery out of here. And I take my negative lead and I plug it in here so that my negative and positive aren't going to touch. And it's going to dissipate some of its heat. I'm going to long press this again to get it to reset. And then we will get our big battery cabled in. One of the other tools of the trade, and both of these will be linked in the description down below, is this high precision watt meter and power analyzer. It's got a source and a load. And when you plug it into a battery, let's plug it in real quick for you, it will also give you a whole bunch of useful information. So I plug that into the source side, and it will tell me consumption rates. So currently the battery's at 3.08 volts. It's fluctuating between 06, 07, and 08, which is just fine. And then it will tell me the amps draw, it'll tell me the VMs, it'll tell me the watts, it'll tell me a whole bunch of information, but it'll also keep track of how many amp hours right there are drawn out of the battery. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use both of these together. So if I take this and I plug this into the load side, there's my red lead, there's my black lead, and then I will take this and I will plug it into the power poles that come off of the big battery, and I'll show you all this hookup here in a second. And then we can start this test. And I'm actually going to turn this down to 5 amps once it gets started, because I think 10 amps might be too hot for today. Alright, so there we go. Let's tune this down to, there's 4.5, 5.3, 4.75, and we'll get this as close to 5 amps as we can. There we go, 5 amps, dead on. Let's take a look at the setup. What we have is the Sycon battery here, and it is plugged in using a set of alligator clip leads that go through this monstrosity of electrical cable, and they plug into the battery load tester. This will go dark the minute that this thing is dead with power. So if I catch it, I catch it, and if I don't, I don't. What this thing here is really good for is if you were out doing a Parks on the Air activation or something along those lines, then you'll want to take a note of what the numbers are at the beginning of your activation, do your whole activation, and take a note at the end. And then just keep that running log on a piece of paper somewhere, maybe on top of the battery on a sticker or something, and then you'll be able to count up the amp hours that you have consumed out of the battery over the many POTA activations that a battery this size would give you. Because like I said, the minute you unplug this battery load monitor, it's lost its mind. There are ways to keep up with that. Let me show you. On the side here, there is a little plug, and you can make up a little connector for an external battery, and then this thing here will run off of the external battery while it is monitoring the power coming from this battery out to your load. And here we are talking about that load again. I've used the alligator clips plugged into the Anderson power pole, and you just want to make sure that the red and the black don't touch, and it's fairly easy to do, but you know, be aware of it. And then there is the MakerHawk load, and it is running. The MakerHawk load says 5.03 amps drawn, 5.04. It'll fluctuate a little bit as things get hotter or cooler. And then this one here is saying 4.95, and you're never going to find 2 meters that agree on anything. So all of these numbers have a lot to do with the current conditions, the ambient temperature in the room, the draw that's going on it, who makes the meter, all that kind of jazz. At a 100 amp hour battery, and with the type of consumption that we do in radio activities where we really don't have specific transmit and reception times, these numbers are going to be all over the place, and close enough is close enough. Let's do some math. We've been draining this battery for a while now, and you can see some of the statistics that are popping up on the screen of this battery monitor. So we're still at 4.95 amps of consumption. The battery has dropped down to 12.86 volts under load. We've got our AP figure, our watt figure, our VM figure. So there's lots and lots of useful information on here, but the one that I'm the most interested in is this one here. So far we're at 3.45 amp hours of consumption out of our 100 amp hour battery. So it's going to take me about 20 hours to get this thing fully discharged. We're going to take a look at 2 really popular radios. The first one is going to be the Yaesu FT891. This is a 100 watt mobile radio, and mobile radios are designed to run off of your car's battery or alternator and don't really need to worry about power consumption. So this will be kind of the same amount of power that a regular 100 watt base station that you'd use in your ham shack would work as well. And then we'll take a look at more of a QRP radio and make a comparison on those two. So inside of the manual, we need to take a look for the power consumption specifications. I'm going to find that real quick. Okay, so Yaesu doesn't give you a ton of information when you get there. This is page 58 of the manual. page 56 of the print, but page 58 actual, you know how that works when you, anyway. And if you look here, it says current consumption. On receive, 2 amps of electricity are going to be consumed by this radio. With this thing receiving at 2 amps, rough seat of the pants math is 50 hours of time just listening to this radio on an active frequency. Say you tune into, the maritime mobile net just to listen to see what's going on the traffic there, or if you tune into FT8 to hear the melodious signals of FT8, someplace where there's almost constant receive traffic. It's going to give you about 50 hours worth of runtime without doing any transmitting whatsoever. Now let's talk about transmitting a little bit. This says transmit is going to take typically 23 amps of power consumption. So again, seat of the pants math, 100 divided by 23 gives us 4.34 hours. So you could key down on the FT891, don't do this, but you could key down on the FT891 at full 100 watts output power for a little over 4 hours before the 100 amp hour battery ran dry on you. You don't want to do that. Your radio would probably let the smoke out before it let the signal out, before the battery drained that you're trying to test here. But that's not the way ham radio works. That's just the 2 worst case scenarios. I'm going to listen only about 50 hours. I'm going to transmit only about 4.5 hours. So that is a 100 watt typical average radio. Let's take a look at the ICOM 705 instead and see what it does. This is the ICOM 705 manual. You can find this on page 87. They put this stuff right up at the beginning of the manual. This is page 87 out of 100 so that you will know. And then on receive, on standby, so this is, with an average amount of signal, not a whole lot of signal, 0.3 amps. And then maximum audio, so you're listening to FT8 or something like the maritime mobile net where there's almost a constant amount of noise coming out of the radio. This will give you a half amp of current draw. So 100 amp hour battery times half an amp, you're going to get 200 hours of listen time on this radio. So this radio really is a low power consumption radio that's optimized for running off of batteries compared to a typical base station radio or a mobile radio that's designed to work off of a near constant power source. So 200 amp hours of listen time is a lot of hours of listen time. You'll get bored way before this battery runs dead. And I guess to put that in perspective, there are 24 hours in a day, so we take 200 and we divide that by 24, and that gives us 8.5 days of listening. You will be back in the range of shore power long before you run out of battery power on something like this. You'll be somewhere where you can charge this battery, either with a solar panel or a wall plug or something along those lines, long before you run out of battery power. So it'll last you 100% of the time is where I was going with that. In terms of transmit power, on an external battery on the IC705, you can transmit at 10 watts compared to the FT891's 100 watts of transmit power. And this will consume 3 amps. Quick seat of the pants math here. 100 amp hours divided by 3 amps of draw gives you 33 hours of runtime on transmit. Again, that's full key down, full signal, full duty cycle mode. 10 watts gets you 33 hours of transmit time. Don't do that because your radio will not be very happy. Again, you're going to blow up your radio long before you consume all of the stuff in the battery and get out there. And so let's talk about duty cycle for a minute. Duty cycle is the amount of time that your radio spends in transmit, in standby, and in receive. So active signals on receive versus no signals on receive is what we call standby or receive. And then in transmit, that's what I was talking about when I mentioned key down. So for key down, you have to really think hard about how you're going to do that. Even something like FT8 is not a 100% duty cycle mode. We call it that just to kind of warn you off of doing something like that. But what happens in FT8 is you transmit for 15 seconds, then you listen for 15 seconds. So there's a 15-second pause. So technically, to split hairs, it's a 50% duty cycle mode, because if you were running FT8 at 100% operator capacity, you'd be transmitting for 15 seconds and relaxing for 15 seconds. Transmitting for 15, relaxing for 15, and on as that goes. So your radio does have an opportunity to cool down. So here's where the real conversation on duty cycle comes into play. A lot of radio manufacturers will tell you about their duty cycle. If you go out and you do a quick search for a typical ham radio duty cycle, you will find lots of information about what a typical ham radio duty cycle is. And a lot of that's going to refer down to 5590. And the 5590 refers to transmit, receive, and standby, which is what I alluded
alluded to a little bit earlier. So they expect you to be transmitting 5% of the time, receiving 5% of the time, receiving an active signal, and then 90% of the time you're going to be receiving silence, static over the airwaves, because there's no such thing as silence in ham radio, right? And so that's where you can start doing your calculations of what that 5590 is.
We are at the 30 amp hour consumption mark on the battery tester, and I changed it up to about 9 amps of draw, and you can kind of feel that the table, you can feel some warmth. This is a downdraft fan, so the air is coming through over the heatsink and out. You can kind of feel warmth on your hands. And I want to check the wire leads to see if they're getting hot at all, if they feel good, bad, or indifferent. And so far they're pretty good. There's a little tiny bit of warmth right there on the edge, but overall doing pretty good. And it occurred to me that we should probably talk about wire gauge a little bit. So this says 8.9 amp draw, and that says 9 amp draw. And a lot of that probably has to do with some internal resistance in the wire, in addition to different measuring devices in use here. Overall, running pretty good. 30 amps out of the 100 amp hour battery, and we've been running it for about 4.5 hours so far.
Let's take a look at some spreadsheet math on what this battery will look like under that duty cycle that I just mentioned. So I copied those numbers out of the owner's manual. I've got the ICOM 705 with its transmit, receive, and standby, and the FT891 with its transmit, receive, and standby. The FT891 did not have a standby power consumption. It's not a power optimized radio because it doesn't need to be. So I just copied the receive over to the standby, make an assumption there. It's okay for the purposes of this exercise. Then I did a little bit of calculations here based on this data column down here. This is that 5590 transmit, receive, and standby listening time that we described earlier. So if I take the 3 amps draw on transmit and I multiply that by 5%, that gives me 15. And if I do the half by 5, that gives me 0.3. And if I do the 0.3 by 90, that gives me 27. And then if I add all of those together, that will give me 0.45 consumed per hour at 5% transmit, 5% receive, 90% standby. And then on the 891 100-watt radio plugged into a humongous power source with the 23.2 and 2, we add all three of those up and we get 3.05 for our consumption. Now let's take that and do some math on our 100 amp hour battery scenario that we've been working with during this video. If I run the 5590 scenario against my 100 amp hour battery with my ICOM 705, I can expect 224.72 hours of usability, factoring in this duty cycle. And then if I do the FT891, I can expect 32.79 hours of runtime at this duty cycle. That's what the battery manufacturer wants you to do. Let's say that you're going to do the absolute best job that you can do, and you're going to run this thing at FT8 and you are going to be on it. You're going to be operating 100% of the time. You're going to be watching that over and doing that thing. So you are transmitting for 15 seconds, you are receiving for 15 seconds, you're transmitting 15, receiving 15. There is no standby, there's no getting up and going to the bathroom, there's no coffee breaks, there's no nothing. You are just on it. You're hammering it as hard as you can. Your FT891 is going to give you 8 solid hours at that. You're not going to make it. Your IC705 is going to give you 57.14 hours. That's over a week's worth of full-time work put in just making FT8 contacts solid, no bathroom breaks. You're not going to do that either. So realistically, what we're looking at here is these 100 amp hour batteries are going to last you for multiple activations. And so that's why we're also talking about the power logging devices and getting a feel for what's going on and kind of proving our case here. So now you can take some of this data and you can make it your own with your own radio by looking in the owner's manual that comes with the radio. We've taken the battery and discharged it most of the night. What I did was I took the dials on the Maker Hawk and turned it all the way down to 0 draw. Right now you can see it's at 10 in that upper right corner. And the fan stopped and I felt like I was going to be safe for the night and I went to bed. It's probably not that big of a deal, but I like to, worry about things that other people don't worry about. This guy here stayed lit up, but it lost its mind. It lost its track of what it was doing. So all I can use this for without having the external battery plugged in we talked about earlier is to see the amp draw. And so this says 16.7 amp hours is what I pulled out of it so far this morning. And you can see that this one here says 85.92 amp hours, 0.93 amp hours drawn out of the battery so far. So this one did a good job of remembering its stuff because it has external power plugged into it. And again, we're running at 10 amps now. I'm getting a little more confident in the whole setup and the heat dissipation and everything, and it doesn't feel too bad. But it's also not the hottest point of the day here yet. And the battery is loving life. It's doing its job. It's putting out 12.1 volts there, and does it say over here? It says 11.7 over here, and again, I think that's because of some inefficiencies in the wiring. But we're gonna keep going until she's dead.
We have now hit the 100 amp hour mark. We've got 100.27 amp hours and we're at 11.2 volts. So this battery is performing better than what it is rated at. We should have cut off at somewhere near 100 amps and somewhere near 10 volts, and we still have another volt or two to go before we get there. I'm going to let this run for a little bit longer, but I think we've passed the test. All right, we're at 104.78 amp hours. This is saying 8.85 volts. This one here is saying 8.9 volts, 9.0 volts. And then I've got my trusty multimeter here. I'm going to have to rearrange because I don't have enough hands. You're not going to be able to see that, but I will tell you what it says. It says 9.3 volts. This thing should be shutting off any second now. And I shut the camera off right when it shut off. So this is 0.0 volt. This one here is absolutely dark. And this is what I was talking about. If you don't have that external power source plugged in, you are going to lose all of your data. So you got to keep a paper log to back that up, or stay tuned for an upcoming video where I'll show you how to do the battery backup on this. And you can kind of, I can hear the fan running down. I don't know if you can hear it, but we are spinning down 104.86 amp hours. There goes the fan. And we're done. 1,262.25 watt hours, 104.86 amp hours. It took 12 hours, 18 minutes, and 19 seconds. Like I said, I did pause it overnight, and I did that just simply by turning the dials all the way down to draw 0 amps off of the device. And we're good to go. I'm going to go ahead and clear this now. And we're ready for the next test. Well, there's some battery math for you. I hope that helps you out. Leave some comments down below if you have any questions or if you have any scenarios that you would like to run through. The Sycon battery that was the host of today's show was a sponsored item, and there is a 3% off discount in the description. If you go to Amazon, you'll also see, when I looked at it, there was a coupon where you could get additional money off and save a lot more on this battery, and that sun is bright. Yeah, wow, that sun is really bright. So make sure you clip the coupon on Amazon and also type in the code in the description down below. Also, you'll see the Maker Hawk and the inline battery monitor. And stay tuned for an upcoming video. Be sure you're subscribed to see it when I go over that battery monitor and how to do some paper logging and how to plug it in so it doesn't lose its mind. But you're not going to keep it plugged in between activations anyway, so both of those are valuable things to know. There's a video right over here I think you'll enjoy next. Thanks for being awesome. I'll see you over there.